Hi, welcome to a Microsoft Reactor live stream series, Let's Get Technical. So you have joined us previously, it's great to have you back. So if you're new here, here's where you can catch up on our previous Let's Get Technical topics on demand. I'll share the link over here, so you can just join us. So the Let's Get Technical is a series of 3 short 55-minute virtual events delivering technical demos and know-hows on the latest technologies in Asia. So we do have episodes in this series conducted in different languages like English, Bahasa Indonesian, Tagalog, Thai, Vietnamese, and we'll love to do more of this. So tell us in the comments below what kind of topics you would love for us to cover. Or to be honest, it would be great to hear from you what timing and time zone works best for you when it comes to learning from live streams like this. And you can, of course, take this time to hit on the like and subscribe button, and that would make myself, our speaker today, and everyone at Microsoft Reactor very happy. So today, we are super honored to have Dave Glover, Principal Cloud Advocate at Microsoft and a familiar face to many, joining us today. So Dave is a passionate software developer and is super interested in many technologies, particularly AI, low-powered embedded platforms, communications, and cloud system. So let's invite Dave to join us now.
Hi, thank you very much.
Hello, Dave. Great to have you join us from Sydney today.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I'd love to say it was warm, but it's actually pretty chilly here in Sydney at the moment, unfortunately. Winter.
Right. So, Dave, usually it's a practice for us here at Let's Get Technical that we share a fun and casual side of our speakers. So, apart from the usual bio and all. So, it's usually quite a pleasant surprise for our speakers. So, I'm quite sure it's going to be good fun. So, we'll do 5 of this or that questions. Are you ready?
Okay.
Sure. Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Cool. Ice cream on a winter day or hot chocolate in a heat wave?
Oh, ice cream anytime.
I'm quite surprised though because you said about like how it's winter and dreary. So like I'm like, oh, okay, surprise. Okay, glass half empty or glass half full?
Definitely a half full person.
Same here. Okay, so we are on that. Saturday or Sunday?
Ooh, probably a Sunday. Yeah, by
Oh,
that stage I'm starting to chill out.
okay, I prefer Saturday because it's nice to know that the next day is still a non-working day. Like you can sleep in.
Yeah, that would go for that too. Yep.
Okay, the last one: pizzas or burgers?
Probably a burger. Yeah,
Mm,
burgers.
yeah. Okay, same here. So, all right. So this is how we learn more about you, Dave, in a good 10 seconds. But on a more serious note, Dave, why don't you briefly share today, like why the topic that you're sharing today actually matters?
Okay, so what we're going to talk about today is around building large language model applications. And what I'm going to be showing you is kind of low code ways of doing this. And if you think about lots of businesses, customers, everyone's grappling with the idea about how do you integrate large language models into apps. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about.
Sounds very fun. And at this point, I encourage you, audience, to start your GitHub code space. So the link is actually here on the screen, and I'm actually going to drop it in the chat as well. Let me do that. So you can just copy and get it running. Right. So, and before we kick off the session, I'd like to draw everyone's attention to the Reactor Code of Conduct. So it's pretty lengthy here, but in short, we want to encourage you to keep this environment an enjoyable one. So make sure that your comments are respectful, constructive, and welcoming. So at any time, if you do have questions, you can drop them on the chat and we'll try to address them as many as possible during Q&A. So yeah, so over to you, Dave. Have a good one.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, so just on the note of starting up the code space. Now, the goal of this workshop is for you to play along and do the workshop as we go. Now, I'm not 100% sure how successful this will be, but the first thing you need to do is you need to start up your GitHub code space. So there was a link in the page, and what you need to do is you need to go to click on code, and then I've already started up my code space, but there will be a box in here which says start a code space. So do that. It'll take about a minute to get started, and it'll just be something that's there for up and running. So I'm going to, in places, slow down and just let you potentially play around with it, and I'll have a bit of a sense of what people are doing through an admin console. So, as I said, go to get that link. The link is, or just go back to the slides. In case you lost the link is, up with the link. That's the link there. So aka.ms/reactor-rag-cs for CodeSpace. So go and start that up, and hopefully by the time we get to this part of the workshop, you'll be up and running. Okay, so anyway, a quick introduction to myself. So we had a bit of a this and that. So I'm based in Sydney, Australia, and I'm in the cloud advocacy team. And my role is basically an outreach role. So outreach to the developer community. I've been at Microsoft for close enough to over 30 years, actually. So I've been around for quite some time, and have seen lots of different revolutions across the IT sector, really across the last 30 years. If you think about, there's been personal computers, there's been the internet, there's been mobile, and of course now we're looking at AI. And each one of those have had challenges, and we're going to talk through some of those things. Now, also feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. So my alias on LinkedIn is Gloveboxes. I think I'm probably David Glover on LinkedIn, and do feel free to follow along. Now, the workshop itself is going to be at this link here, aka.ms/reactor-rag. And that's got a full workshop. In fact, I'm going to pop across to that now and just show you what is in there. Because what I decided when I was building this workshop is I wanted something that was highly repeatable so that you could, maybe in your workplace or with your friends or family, should you choose to do so, would be able to reproduce this workshop all the way to, I don't know, if you're working with meetups or things like that. It has all of the notes about what you need to provision, what you need to go and set up, the flow of the workshop. Everything is in this workshop to make it super easy for you to go back and reproduce this workshop, and including the PowerPoint notes. Sorry, including the PowerPoint slides. You'll see there's both English version and Japanese, because we happen to do this in Japan. But you will see the slides complete with all of my speaker notes. So when you look at this and you think, oh, that's just what Dave said, it's probably because when I was rehearsing and building this session, I wrote the speaker notes down. So it'd be super easy for anybody else to go and reproduce this session. So that's my goal, is that you will be able to reproduce this session later on and carry it on. Now, the other thing that I've done with this workshop is all the resources, all of the OpenAI resources, I have granted, or we have what's called an OpenAI or an AI proxy. So I've enabled the resources for this workshop to run for about a week. So you don't have to worry about, oh gosh, I don't have any access to OpenAI models. I can't do this workshop. I've set up an event, and within that, I've allocated out some resources so that you can use them for this workshop. So that's kind of what you can do as you carry on. So that's the general gist of it. So the goal of this workshop is that you should have a better understanding of what is going on with large language models from Microsoft, and what are we doing around building around the platform and tools to make it easy for you to go and build, to make it easy for you to go and build these style of applications. So as I said, all the source code, all the documentation is available for this workshop. Okay, so we're going to be touching on an introduction to large language model operations. I'm going to be talking about Azure AI Studio, and the most of this demo, or most of this talk, is around prompt flow. And we're going to talk about prompt flow. So think about prompt flow is like a low-code way of building a large language model application, or REST endpoint. And we'll get to that in a moment. So we're going to build an application. So we're going to build what's called a RAG, or retrieval, augmentation, and generative application with prompt flow and Visual Studio Code. And depending on time, we'll also look at some of the evaluations that can be that you can do. Okay, so now I've already touched upon this already, but with all major revolutions, particularly in technology, they always come with opportunities and challenges. And that would be things like mainframe computing, personal computing, internet, AI, mobile, etc. They all come with opportunities and challenges. Now, what we're doing with large language ops is we're building out a series of platforms, tools, best practices, and frameworks to make it easier for you to build this. And you'll see this term bandied about called large language model operations. And it has a life cycle. And I'm just going to talk through this. If you've done any other kind of apps operations life cycle, it'll look very similar. So you typically think about you've got an idea. So, and you want to think about, okay, how can I've got a business idea or a business need. How could I use a large language model to maybe make this application real? And then you kind of go through this whole iterative process. Like, I'm going to try a few prompts. Did that work? Did that kind of meet the hypothesis? Do I think I can do this, achieve this with this larger language model? Maybe this large language model is no good for my needs, and I can go and iterate on different large language models and things like that. So there's that whole idea of ideating and exploring different ideas. And then the next phase of that is, okay, you've got the basis of an idea. So what are we going to do around trying to make this a bit more real? And that's kind of the building and augmenting phase, where you're looking at the application, you're trying out maybe some sample data, you're seeing how well that responds to that sample data you might be using to ground your prompt. You'll be looking at things like evaluation. Is this application performing well? Am I starting to get hallucinations? Is the model starting to respond in ways using my data that maybe I didn't intend? So maybe I need to look at the prompts, the grounding, the data I'm using for grounding, just to kind of help steer the model in the right direction to kind of give you the kind of responses that you're wanting from these applications. The next phase is around operationalization, productizing, or moving to operations. And the whole thing around that is then you start thinking about, well, what's the cost management for this? Are we within budget? Can we monitor this application now it's in production? Is it working and performing and within the guidelines? There's also things like model drift. So maybe you've got a new model, or maybe you've got a new data set, or maybe you've done some different prompts. And then you want to be testing, is this model still, and is this application still behaving the way that we originally envisaged? So that's kind of come down the whole operation. And it's also things like safety. So is this application, does it perform well in the way that we want it to perform, that's consistent with our organizational brand and things like that? Is it secure? Is it network secure and things like that? So those are kind of things that we do. And inside all that, what we do is we wrap this up in a management fabric. So then you've got CI/CD pipelines, all those types of things. You can start testing this application, automating the test of this application. Is it performing the way that I expect this application to be performing, and things like that. Okay. So as I mentioned before, with all revolutions really come around a series of platforms, tools, best practices, and documentation, things like that. And that's very much what we're doing around this whole Azure AI. Now, Azure AI Studio in particular is really the center of gravity for what Microsoft is doing around AI and generative AI and building applications to that style. So Azure AI Studio has access to thousands of models. So you would expect obviously things like OpenAI models, but there's also Meta, there's Hugging Face models, there's Mistral models, which are now, it provides tools in there for grounding your applications, if you're building RAG style applications, which is effectively what this talk is about. So you will have data sets inside your business that you want to provide for your application. So for example, you might have product information or customer support information that you want to use to ground the large language models and those applications so they respond back with your data. There's tools in there for prompt evaluation, safety and responsible AI, and continuous monitoring. And the whole idea behind this is that ultimately, when we're going to build an application with prompt flow, we're going to build this with Visual Studio Code as well as the prompt flow extension. And what we're going to do is we're going to deploy that to Azure AI Studio, and then that application will then be available to be consumed within your application. So basically what's happening is you're going to deploy it as a large language model REST endpoint that is grounded on your data. So that's kind of what we're ultimately going to be doing. Okay, so we talked about AI Studio as kind of the center of gravity for what we're doing around all things generative AI. So the next thing we want to talk about is prompt flow and what prompt flow is about. So prompt flow, as I mentioned before, is really around providing a low-code way of building out applications. So there are a number of styles, a number of ways in which you can go and build RAG-based applications. So there can be what I'd call code-centric or custom code-centric. So you might have heard things like LangChain, you might have heard things like semantic kernel or OpenAI Assistant API. Those are quite code-centric approaches to building RAG-style applications. But what prompt flow is about providing a low code, or maybe truer to say low-ish code. So it can be low code and very much drag and drop, but you can extend it, and you almost certainly will have to extend it. But the goal of prompt flow is to provide a way of simplifying the whole process from prototyping, experimenting, iterating, deploying, and monitoring. The importance I want to say is emphasize around deploying, because a lot of people don't realize, they think, oh, this is great for experimenting, but this is this whole end-to-end from experimenting all the way through to deploying to the cloud, to Azure, and monitoring that application. And you can deal with things like it will create you the executables. It has support in there for debugging. It will create the ability for you to say, okay, I'm going to do A/B testing. How does this look? How does the performance compare of one set of models and one set of prompts versus another set of models and a different set of prompts? And you can test that. And all the way through to deploying these large language model applications into Azure. Okay, so I want to talk a bit about what RAG style applications are. You've probably potentially heard about RAG style applications, but you're not quite sure why or what's the relevance of them, or how do they work. So the first point I want to make is that kind of like the number one success, the number one thing that would determine how successful your large language model application will be is context. And that context will be related to your data. So the context will be your product data, your customer support data, your frequently asked questions, whatever it is. It's about your data, which is going to provide context into this large language model app. Now, there are effectively two ways in which you can go and create or build an application, a large language model for context. Now, you might have heard of something called fine-tuning. Now, what fine-tuning is about is you'll take a large language model and what we call a foundational model, and you will add your layer to the top of that model, and you will tune it with your context, so your product set, your data set, and things like that. Now, the downside of fine-tuning is it's quite complex and typically a high initial cost. But there will be some use cases where it does make sense to fine-tune, and maybe at a longer term, it might make more cost-effective sense. But my general premise is if you've got data which is quite dynamic, like customer order history or product sets that are changing, that's probably not the way to go because you have to go and fine tune your models with your data that's changed. So that's typically where you go and use RAG. So I'm going to talk through. So there's two ways approach. There's this fine tuning. You go and basically add a layer to the foundational model, or you can take this RAG, which is this retrieval augmented generation approach. And the way this works is that you can imagine you've got like a chatbot and or an internal support. So you've got a user who asks a question. So what you would do is that you would retrieve data. You basically do a look aside and you would retrieve related data to that user question. So then you'd come back with that data and then you'd augment the prompt. So that prompt might have, and I'll get to that, what it would look in a moment, and you'd augment that prompt with data from some backend data store. It could be a vector store, it could be a relational database, it could be whatever. And then what you do is that you send that data off to a large language model and you generate a response, and that response will come back to the end user. Now, there's a question here about how would this integrate with Confluence data? Well, Confluence data could just be a data source that you went and did a look aside. You typically need to have some sort of index, and you go and query that index, and it could be inside Confluence, and then you bring back relevant data from Confluence, or it could be Azure AI Search Index or Redis or whatever it is. Could be a whole lot of backend data sources, and you grab that data, and then you would augment the prompt with that data you grabbed from Confluence, and then you would send that whole data prompt off to the large language model and get a response back from it. So hopefully that kind of answers your question. Okay, so now this example here, we're kind of building out, it's like a product support or a product information chatbot. So we've been to plenty of sites where you've been and studied, you want to talk to that, and you want to get information about that. And as we know that sometimes that can be a bit hit or miss. And what large language models can significantly improve that experience that you might be giving to an end user. Now, besides that chatbot, there are lots of different other scenarios that that large language models can play a great part, great part in for using large language models. I like to split these things out into risk, so high risk and low risk. So when you think about, if you've got a business idea and you think about, well, this is quite a high risk, then the general rule of thumb is that you want to collaborate with AI. So in which case, so give you an example, like a doctor. If you want to do some patient diagnosis, then if it was me or if I was a doctor, I would want to collaborate with that doctor, but I'm great using AI to help with that diagnosis of maybe an issue that I've got. So that would be a good example of collaborate. But then you might be another situation, maybe you've got making large economic decisions. Well, you probably don't want AI necessarily just going off and creating these economic decisions that may be for the country, for a large company. So those are typically collaborate. Now, there are plenty of low risk ones, like the one we're going to talk about, we're going to build customer support. Maybe with customer support with handover, when you sense that maybe the customer is getting frustrated with the data they're getting back, you want to hand it over to a real person. But things like information retrieval, it could be policy documents inside an organization, content generation, language translation, great examples, education. You might have a scenario where you've got, you're inside a university and you've got all your course curriculum and you've got students who are doing tests, and then you can figure out, well, that's interesting. This student is struggling in this particular area. I can use generative AI to go and generate content that will help the student learn in areas where they're weak. So you can do things like that. So general idea, break things out into low risk and high risk. Think about collaborate or automate. So low risk, automate, collaborate for high risk. Okay, so I'm hoping by now that some of you, or that you've opened up your GitHub code space. Now, I think we'll probably, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to pop across to my browser. And you remember, so you would have been linked off to my repo, so you'll end up on Glovebox's Contoso chat proxy. And if we go into click on the code button, in the code spaces, you will have in here a green box which says start this code space. Okay, and that's going to go and create, and that takes about a minute to start at the code space. And what you will have when that starts up in your browser, you will have Visual Studio Code in your browser. And you can come along here and we're going to go and do a few things on here. So if you're used to using Visual Studio on your desktop, this is Visual Studio Code running inside a browser, but it's backed by basically a virtual machine that's sitting up in GitHub. It's actually probably a Docker container. Okay, so that's what's going on. So you're ultimately, this takes about a minute to start up, and actually you will see a little warning box down the bottom right-hand corner just to say an API is out of date. Just close that because it won't impact this. Okay, so hopefully you can do that. So the link is there, aka.ms/reactor-rag-codespace. Okay, so the next thing I want to talk about is ideation and exploring prompt flow with CodeSpace. Now, prompt flow with Visual Studio Code, there's an add-in for Visual Studio prompt flow. It has two ways in which you can work. You can work with a code-first user experience or a designer-first user experience, and they're interchangeable, so you can switch between the two of them. Now, the code-first approach is super useful for when you want to do things like check code into GitHub or into your code source code control system, and you want to be able to find out line by line what has changed. So it's a great way of being able to track changes, great way to be able to collaborate with other people in your group, saying, hey, look, we're working on this prompt flow. I need to extend it and do this and that. And the design first experience is kind of more drag and drop. Now, the other thing I want to point out is that what we're going to do today is highly stylized. It's like the start of a 10. Almost certainly your prompt flows are going to be way more complicated. So for example, I'm assuming in this prompt flow we're going to build, it's about information retrieval. But I might have gone to your website and I might be looking for customer support. And it's going to be really frustrating to me if I go and say, I want information about, I need help with a tent, and I'm looking for customer support, and then your website tries to start selling me the latest and greatest tent. That is obviously not going to go down very well. So in a prompt flow, you often need to deal with customer intent. And you'll find in that GitHub repo, if you go and look at one of the other folders, you'll see things about understanding intent. But in this example here, we're going to keep it really simple and not deal with intent. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so the next thing that this app is going to use, and almost all RAG applications use, is some sort of vector database. Now, the vector database we're going to be using is Azure AI Search, and it's a hybrid database. And then what I've done is I've created what are called embeddings. Now, an embedding is just a special type of vector which is being generated from a large language model which has semantic meaning. So basically, you would have each product description, you would send it off to an embedding model, something like OpenAI's text embedding Ada, something like that. Or there's a new one called text embedding small. And that would generate this vector. And that vector plus the text you would put into your index. And then what happens when a user wants to come along and search, excuse me, they would put a query in. And what you need to do is you need to go and generate an embedding for that query. So I need small waterproof shoes. I would create an embedding using exactly the same model that I created the embeddings when I created the search index. And then I would send this off to in this case, Azure AI Search. And Azure AI Search would do what's called a nearest neighbor lookup of the index, as well as a keyword search, and it would return back the relevant results. In this case here, the relevant results would be the search results, I need warm shoes. The relevant results would be trail walker, hiking shoes, and there'd obviously be some related information to that. Now, there are lots of different vector stores. I'm happen to be showing Azure AI Search, but there's Redis, there's Postgres, there's Pinecone, there's Weaviate. There's a number of these vector searches out there, vector stores out there. Okay, so the next thing I need you to do is this is where you can get access to OpenAI resources. So you need to go to this link. So this aka.ms/reactor-rag. And I'm just going to go to that link myself. And it will take you to this page here. It's called Let's Get Technical, RAG prompt flow. And in here, this is the workshop we're going to do. And in here is the link to the workshop. And right mouse click on this and open this in another link, another page, because you're going to want that as you go. Now, as an aside, when you access this, this will give you access to some OpenAI, gives you access to GPT 3.5, GPT-4, and text embeddings, and a read-only index for Azure AI Search. If you're new to prompt engineering, you might want to go and do this workshop here. We're not going to do this workshop, but I thoroughly recommend doing this if you haven't done this. And when you've logged in with your GitHub account, which I've already done, you will see you've got your API key and your proxy endpoint, and you're going to need those for the workshop. Okay, so hopefully a few of you have done that. Okay, so it doesn't look like too many have done, so I'm probably going to assume that you're going to do this after. So we'll see how we go. Right, so you need to set up that and get connected to that workshop. Right. So the first part of this workshop, I'm going to demonstrate this, and you'll be able to do this after this workshop. As I said, the resources will be available after this workshop, and it might just be easier for you to play along. So we're going to create, and we're going to build a RAG style application, and I'm going to show you how you do this inside prompt flow. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the workshop. And the workshop here, in fact, if I go to the introduction, you will find that the slides I've talked about are in this workshop. So super easy for you to follow on. I think I didn't quite understand that, what was going on. Okay, so what we're going to do, you're going to do this event using these resources that have been allocated via a proxy to make it easier for you to go and get up and running. And the resources that are backing this workshop, we've got Azure AI Search and Azure OpenAI. And in here, I'll just make this a little bit bigger. You would have created a code space and got up and running building that code space. Okay, so I can see about 7 people have done this. Okay, so you've been off to GitHub Codespaces, and then from your browser you've opened up that Codespace and you've got that. So we're going to learn about grounding your data. So we talked about that. There's 2 ways of doing that. We're going to ground the prompt, the RAG application with Azure data from Azure AI Search and from data from a product history, customer order history. Right, okay. So the first thing you need to do is you need to go into the code space, and you need to open this file in there. You'll see it's called environment, and you need to add in the proxy endpoint and the Azure AI key that you got from when you signed up. So remember, this is where the API key is, and that's where the endpoint is. So you'll do that inside of, oh, my code space decided it wanted to close. So hopefully that won't take too long to start up. Okay, so while it's starting up, we're going to go to the workshop. And the first thing we're going to do when this starts up, we're going to look at the tools that the prompt flow extension adds. So we'll come over here, and that is still loading up. It should hopefully take about 30 seconds. And on the side, you'll see that there is a prompt flow tool. And in that, you can get access to connections. You can see what connections are available for your prompt flow and what other resources are available. So we'll come across to, okay, we're up and running. So as I said, the first thing you need to go and do is you need to go into this environment, and you need to add in your endpoint and your key. And I'm going to come across here, and I'm going to add in my endpoint. Paste that in, and my key. Run that in there, save it away. And then the next thing you're going to do is you're going to go across to in fact, this is a trick that I found with prompt flow. When you've gone into code spaces, you will find that your toolbar is on the left-hand side by default. I find that with using prompt flow, by far the best way is to have it on the right-hand side. And this will become more apparent as we go through. So what you want to do is you want to open up the connections folder, and you want to go and open up a Jupyter notebook called proxy-create-connections. Make sure you open up the one that starts with proxy-create. And then what you're going to do is you're going to do run all. And it's almost certainly would have prompted you to go and select a Python environment, take the recommended Python environment, and then run that. And it will run. It will take a matter of moments. And what that is doing is that is setting up all your connections. So if we come down over here into the prompt flow, we'll see down the bottom is that will create a connection to Azure OpenAI. You'll see down the bottom right-hand corner, and you'll see I've got a connection there called Azure OpenAI connection, and another one called Cognitive Search. Now, Cognitive Search is the old name for Azure AI Search, so this tool hasn't quite caught up. And you'll find that there's definitions for those. Okay, so back in the notes. So we've created our environment, and we've run that proxy connection to go and create that. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a very simple prompt flow. So I'm going to go back into my code space, and from the file, you'll see down there's a folder called workshop. What you're going to do is you're going to right mouse click on that workshop, and you're going to go new flow in this directory. And that's going to fire up a prompt. And then you're going to select the third one down, which is chat flow with a template. Okay. So what that will do is that will create you a starter template. And you'll see at the top here, there's a little, if you hover the mouse over, you'll see that there's a visual editor. You go and select that. And what that will do is it will start up your chat. You go and click on that, and you'll see that there's a little red triangle. So you select that, and that on the left-hand side will bring up the chat, the properties for the chat, what are called tools. So these are called tools. Click on the drop-down and select the Azure OpenAI connection. Okay, so you've got that set, and the next thing you want to go and set is input. So in this case, you want to go and select inputs, and over here you want to go and say what tent would you recommend for beginners. Probably needs two M's in there. Okay, so we've set up this, and what this is going to do, we're going to run this. Now at the top, you will see that there is a number of icons or buttons that you can select. So there's one there for run all. You can go and hit batch run, and you can also debug. So in this case here, we're going to run this. And we're going to run it with standard mode. Now, there's a few folk who've just got a little bit caught out. And I think for the folk that have got, I think there's somebody here struggling with the API key and endpoint. My recommendation is maybe just watch, because we're going to run out of time otherwise, and then just go back. So watch, and I'm going to go through in quite a lot of detail. So just watch what I'm doing and then just go back and reproduce it. Now, when I ran that flow, what it did is it came back with an answer. You can see down the bottom here, for beginners, I would recommend a simple and easy dome tent. Now, what that's done is that that's grabbed the data for what tent would you recommend. It's just grabbed it from the data that the model was trained on. It's not using the data that is inside my business that I want this prompt flow to use. So we go back over to the workshop. So we got up to here and we've created a new prompt flow, and we've put in what tent would you recommend for beginners. And what that's done is it's just grabbed a generic response. This is what the data was available, and the models come back with a not unreasonable response, but it's not relevant to my organization and my data. So you'll see all the way through here, there's documentation about how to go and do all this. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to now start building out this application to do the whole RAG, retrieve, augment, and generate. So we've talked all about this, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to update the YAML, which describes the flow, the prompt flow. So I'm going to come across back to my code space. I'm going to close the designer, and that will just leave open. And what I'm going to leave open, the original YAML, the flow.dag.yaml file. I'm just going to delete out everything and paste. Go and paste in that new prompt. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to switch across to the visual editor. Now, what you'll find is that if you remember, I said it's better to have the Visual Studio Code primary bar, sidebar on the right-hand side. It leaves space over here for the properties. It just makes, you'll find that once it stops bouncing around so much. You can move things around. There's also some tools in here you can do zoom to fit, and you can play around with this. Now, this works really well on a wide screen, by the way. Okay, so what I've got in here is I've got a flow. So I've got my input, and my input's going to be recommended tents. I've got an embedding. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to generate an embedding for that question. So what it's going to do is going to send that question off to the text embedding, the OpenAI text embedding 3-small model. And it's going to return back an embedding, for which is a semantic representation of that question. And the next thing I'm going to do is, in parallel to this, I'm going to look up some data in a customer database. And you'll see how there's a little link. So this is a Python customer tool. And you can go and click on the link. And this will take you into the Python tool. And you can go and come in here. In this case, I'm just going to set a breakpoint. We'll just set one breakpoint on there. Okay, and the next, so what it's going to do is going to retrieve some data from both the customer history as well as doing some product lookup. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run this. So now we're doing the first part. So I'm running in standard mode. That will start the prompt. And there'll be some parts in prompt flow will work out what can be done in parallel and what needs to be serialized. And what it's done is it's brought back data. So you can see it's brought back data from my customer order history. So you can see in here, this was product order, previous things I ordered. Sorry, beg your pardon. Yes, it's brought it back my customer order history. And within that, I can come through here and I can look at my output and I can go look at my output. I can open in a new tab. And this is the data that's come back from my customer order and my product data. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do, in fact, the thing I forgot to do is I'm going to go and run this with a breakpoint or run this in debugging mode. So that starts up. And what we'll see is that this will stop executing at the breakpoint. So as you can see with these custom tools, in this case here, I'm going to grab some data from a backend data store, and I want to use that for part of my query. So that's what's going on there. Okay, so the next part, go back to my YAML document. I'm going to go back to the workshop notes. And the next part I'm going to do is I'm going to do augmentation. So I'm going to grab that data that I've grabbed from my product set and my order history and augment it with the customer query. So I'm going to come in there, copy that, come across to the YAML document, paste that in, save it away, and I'm going to go to the visual editor. And you'll see now what we're doing. We've got my customer lookup, and then what we're going to do is we're going to create a meta prompt. And if I go click on that link, this will take you to, it's what's called a Python Ginger template. It's a really standard template builder in the Python world. And you can see that this is just going to build out a prompt, which is ultimately going to be sent off to the large language model. So in this case here, we're going to tell the large language model that it is an AI agent for Contoso outdoor products. And as an agent, you will answer questions briefly and succinctly in a personal manner using Markdown. You'll see things like there's safety. There's a safety section. You will always reference factual data. So you're going to tell the large language model, always reference large language factual data. If you don't have that data, don't go and make it up. You'll have things in here like if there's insufficient, if the search-based does not contain sufficient information to answer the question, go back and ask the question, go back and ask for more data. I like this one hidden here. When in disagreement with a user, you must stop replying and end the conversation. You do not want this large language model to start now having an argument with your customer. And then what's going to be doing, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to be folding in the product data which is relevant to the customer query. So just basically iterating through the data that came back from my product database. And then I'm going to iterate through the previous order history. So now I've got context. I know the products that are relevant to this customer's question, and I've got relevant products, and I've got also relevant order history. And then we've got stuff like, I want to, into this template, I want to put their first name, last name, so I can just personalize back the response. So that's what's kind of going on with this Ginger template. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run in the standard mode. And that will now execute. And in a moment, they'll come back. We'll go to outputs. We'll open in a new tab window. That's not showing entirely what I was expecting. We'll see it down the bottom in terminal. Okay, so this was what came back from that template. So the question was recommend tent for beginners, and this is all of the context that's come back from my product set and my customer order history, including all the way down to the bottom. You'll see that the customer name is Jason Brown, and Jason is 50 years old. Okay, and the membership status and stuff like that. So that's all going in to this prompt. Okay, so that's the A. So we've got RAG, retrieve, we've got A for augment. The next thing we're going to do back in the workshop is we're going to go from step 2 to step 3. So step 3 is a generation. So we're going to copy the template, go across to code spaces again, close the Visual Designer, open and just paste that in, save that away, and down the bottom, we're just going to click on the Visual Editor. Now, what this is going to do, we just resize to fit, and you'll find this UI can be a bit challenging at times. So a trick, have the Visual Studio Code toolbar working on the right-hand side. It'll stop the properties on the left-hand side bouncing around on the UI. So it makes it easier to track. And you'll find that you want to constantly toggle the up and down. Okay, so there was a question, why are we doing it inside Visual Studio Code versus just directly in Azure AI Studio? And you absolutely can do it in Azure AI Studio. Inside Azure AI Studio, it's a design first only experience. That's not entirely true, but the code experience doesn't allow for things like debugging and all those kinds of things you want when you're building out these prompt flows. So you absolutely can do this inside Azure AI Studio, but doing it inside Visual Studio Code gives you a richer debugging experience. Now, by the way, I'm doing this in code space, but normally I'd probably just do this on my own desktop. That's probably what I'd normally do. Okay, so we've now got the application. So we've grabbed the embedding from the question. We've retrieved product data. We've retrieved our customer order history. We've augmented that whole meta prompt. And now we're going to send the whole thing to a large language model. In this case, it's GPT-3.5 Turbo. So I'm going to run this, run it in standard mode. And this will take a moment. And this will execute. And you can see the result comes back. It's now, you remember that first time I tested this, this is now highly personalized to my product, my customer's data, my data. So, hey, Jason Brown, for beginners, I recommend the Sky 2-person tent, catalog item 15. It's the Trailmaster tent. So now we're getting responses back. And then what you would do is you're getting back a JSON object with the relevant detail, and you'd build out a web application, and you'd have a series of links, and these links would link off to this data that's sitting behind the scenes in your backend system. So that's how that's kind of how you kind of bring it all together. Okay, now the bit that I'm not going to show you and that you can't do directly inside this workshop, though this workshop goes all the way through about how to go and set up the resources yourself inside Azure. So for the purpose of this workshop, it's much more about just learning about how prompt flow works. But ultimately, you're going to want to go and deploy that. And to do that, you'll need to go and follow the notes around deploying to Azure. So just keep that in mind. I've shown you all the way up and doing local stuff with large language models, but we can't do deployment because you're not setting up an Azure instance. So just keep in mind, but if you've already got an Azure instance or you go and set up your own, you can set up one for free, you can play around with this and actually go and deploy this. And you remember, ultimately, what this is doing is ultimately this will create you a Docker container that will run this prompt flow, and it will create a REST endpoint that you would call from your application. So it could be your web application, your mobile application, desktop application. It's going to call this REST endpoint, pass through the customer question, and then run it through that prompt flow. And then ultimately this data is going to come back as a JSON object, and then you're going to do whatever you want to do with that JSON object for that customer experience. So hopefully that answers the question about how this is going to work. Okay, so as I said, all of the notes and the introduction, the slides, everything you will find in this GitHub repo. Now, the one thing I haven't covered is that I mentioned this briefly at the beginning. There is also in that workshop work you can do around evaluation. And evaluation is super important because you want to automate how well your prompt flow is performing. And you can set up a number of metrics. In this case here, I've got groundedness, relevance, and coherence. So did the model respond back with relevant questions? And you might be wondering, how are we doing this? So there are a number of styles in which you can do this. This workshop is going to actually use GPT version 4, which is a more expensive but slower but more capable model. And it's going to use GPT version 4 to evaluate the response that came back from a GPT 3.5 model. Now, you will see that this is all documented in that workshop, and it'll take you through the process of using that prompt flow to then go and do evaluations of that prompt, and absolutely worthwhile doing because it's kind of fascinating that we're using AI to evaluate the performance of another AI model. So that's kind of what's going on. Okay, so that's everything there. So remember, the place to get access to all of the resources is on here. So HTTP, so take a photo or a screenshot of that. So it's aka.ms/reactor-rag. And you can do this in your own time. I've left the resources available, will be available from a week from today. So basically, what's today? Wednesday. So it'll be available Wednesday next week. So you have a week to play around with this workshop and just try out ideas and different prompts and things like that. So, okay, so are there any questions? So I've seen a few questions that come through. So please, I think I've been answering the questions pretty much as we go. So are there any more questions? Do ask away. Okay, so I think we're pretty much on time. And I think we're going to hand over to Suzanne and she's going to close up. So thanks very much for taking the time. And feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. My LinkedIn ID is Gloveboxes. So you can see at the top. Feel free to reach out if you have questions, ask me on LinkedIn or my GitHub. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dave.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Right. So thank you so much, Dave, and to our moderator, Eliza, who has been working behind the scenes as well. So if you have missed the demos, you can always watch back today's session. They will be available on demand right away. So I'm just going to redrop the link again here. And yeah, I would also love to invite you to join us for our next Let's Get Technical session, where we talk about Azure Quantum Ecosystem, where the hardware, software solutions are all innovated with via one cloud service. So join us. And switching gears a little, it's the Startup AI School. So if you want to learn more about AI, please join us at Startup AI School. It's usually on Thursdays and Fridays or Fridays. So if you haven't heard, we're actually at the mid of season 1, and you can find all the sessions and details on aka.ms Startup AI School. You can learn about the AI trends and tools, how to use Copilot, And our next session is actually on responsible AI, and that's tomorrow. So we'll love to see you there. So I've also included a survey for today's session. If you have time to fill that out, we'll greatly appreciate that. And this survey is actually important for us to know how we are doing and if we should do something like this again, or what kind of topics would be actually of interest. So yeah, let us know if you'd like us to be back. So, and finally, if you enjoyed today, do us a favor, hit on the like and subscribe, and let us know in the comments that you want more of this. So thank you so much for joining us once again. We'll see you next week. Bye.